So welcome to this second lecture of the Integral Yoga of Sri Aurobindo. In this lecture, I'd like to continue exploring the idea of the integral and also show how Sri Aurobindo expresses what may be called an integrative impulse that in a sense is wider than considering him as an individual that arrives at a certain formulation called the integral yoga, but contextualizes him within the frame of our times. How is it that the idea of the integral is in a way contemporary? That it arises not merely as an idiosyncrasy of an individual, but that the individual expresses something larger belonging to the world in our times. So, to consider this, I'd like to first start with the critique of the integral, which has arisen in our times. More so after Sri Aurobindo than during his time. During his time, the term integral was relatively unknown. He used this term, and afterwards, a number of other people used the term. Some of them were influenced by him. We've already talked about Haridas Chaudhary and Indra Sen. There were others that derived the term from him, and so we find its use in a variety of contexts. In his time, some did not derive it from him, like the philosopher Jean Gebser, who uses the term integral, but later did come across Sri Aurobindo's works and does form a conscious link with him and his work. But in more modern times, particularly after the Second World War, the notion of the integral has been critiqued along with a number of other ideas that have to do with some kind of inclusive category. In fact, one may say that in religious studies, there is a term coined for this category, which is inclusivism. Now, one usually hears of exclusivism with regard to religions. Many religions are exclusivistic in that they feel that they are the primary and only true way to talk about a divine source. But some philosophers or religious thinkers, among them somebody by the name of Paul Hacker, Hacker has coined the term, and others have talked about it, that there is a class of religions or spiritual philosophies that may be called inclusivistic. And Indian schools, particularly the entire discourse of spiritual thought in India, emerging in Hinduism and to some extent in Buddhism and Jainism as well, have been characterized as inclusivistic. The notion of inclusivism has to do with the appropriation of otherness. The idea is that one can say that one is universalist by assuming that whatever forms of religion exist, one belongs to all of them, or one's own religion subsumes all of them. It's wide enough to contain all of them. So this has been one of the notions of modern Hinduism. Hinduism, in its particularly modern emergence in the early 20th century, has made the claim that it has within it the various kinds of ideas and structures that come in all religions of the world. In that sense, it is inclusivistic. The critique of inclusivism is that it appropriates, it speaks for other historical traditions, things which are singular, that have their own unique identity, are subsumed under something else, which in a sense hegemonizes the field. So this kind of sensitivity to the plural has particularly arisen after the Second World War, because the Second World War has brought to the fore this entire notion of fascism. It's political fascism, but behind political fascism there may be ideological fascism. Fascism is the way by which one brings together and hegemonizes. One collects masses and puts a stamp of some kind of uniformity over them, something that binds them together. So, philosophies that have arisen in the post-World War II period, what we may call the properly modern or even contemporary period, have been characterized by a sensitivity towards this kind of appropriating and hegemonizing tendency. We use the general term postmodern for these philosophies. Postmodernism has been concerned about protecting pluralism. So this has been one of the critiques of the term integral as well. That is that integral is another way by which a certain individual philosophy claims that it contains all others, that it is at the peak of the mountain. So that kind of critique has been made about the term integral in more recent times. Now, one variety of that critique has even emerged in the California Institute of Integral Studies and from the Department of East-West Psychology. It is Jorge Ferrer's idea of the participatory turn. So the participatory turn moves in a similar direction to protect pluralism by claiming that integralism can actually uniformalize the field of plurality and does not give sufficient freedom for new forms of philosophy and spiritual experience and practice to arise. A properly postmodern turn to the spiritual field or the field of mysticism would allow for otherness to be the source of engagements that create new experience. We can arrive at new forms of spirituality out of our participatory experiences. This has been the view. Now, when Sri Aurobindo used the term integral, this is partly behind his thinking as well. And that's why it is important to understand how the integral positions itself with regard to unity, uniformity, perennialism, inclusivism, and pluralism. All these ranges of unity and diversity are something that have relationship with the term integral. And what is that relationship? So this is partly what we'll consider today and move on from there to take a closer look at Sri Aurobindo's life and see how what I am terming the integrative impulse works in his life. So one of the things to realize over here is that philosophically speaking, if we look at a field of plurality, a field of infinity, of infinite possible diversity, there is no one thing that can contain them. As soon as you posit a single thing that can contain infinity, you've actually reduced the infinity. You've taken the radical out of the infinite. It is no longer radically infinite. It is essentially a subset of the radically infinite. For example, you can have orders of infinity. All the odd numbers can form an infinite set. But that infinite set is a bounded infinite set. It exists as an infinity by excluding from it other kinds of infinities. And if we were to hegemonize that particular kind of infinity over all infinities or all realities, then we are actually arriving at a kind of ideological fascism. A similar thing can be thought of with regard to perennialism. With perennialism, we find that there is an idea that all religions have got something common to them, that all religions express diverse views on reality, but their core is the same. Now, if we actually try to find such a common core, it is often very difficult. We have to pull things and skew them to make them look the same. We can find similarities, and then these similarities, which are actually heterogeneities, are turned into homogeneities in one's thinking. Again, we may say that that which is common to different religions or different ideas is a sublime commonality. In other words, we cannot really describe it. All religions are arising out of some central experience, but the core of that experience is indescribable, and that is the perennial core. If that is the case, then there is a gap between the describable and the indescribable. The indescribable cannot come into the world of language and manifestation. And we are left with a certain kind of core which cannot be made into something practical in the world. So the integral is neither this idea of the uniform, nor is it the idea of the perennial, whether we think of it as a commonality or as a indescribable core. The integral is not a bounded infinity, as in the case of the infinite set of a lower order than radicality that we were talking about. Integral is not a unity that is finite and then broken into infinite parts. We don't transcendentally establish boundaries and then say that that can be further divided ad infinitum. That is not the integral. To understand the integral, we have to first honor the field of plurality. Radical infinity cannot be contained by a unity, but can be a unity. In other words, one can talk about a single thing which is heterogeneous by nature. One can talk about the one that is infinite. Now, this idea cannot be encompassed by the mind, because the mind dwells in opposites. One of the most fundamental law of the mind is that it should not defy the law of contradiction. In other words, if we have one and not one, which contradicts one, the two cannot be the same. The two do not exist. If something is one, it cannot be not one. If something is not one, it cannot be one. And you cannot have a contrariety between oneness and infinity posing to be the same. If you bring the two together, you'll find that one will dominate the other and speak in its name, so to say. But if you have a consciousness that is what we may call, using the philosophic term, aporetic, in other words, paradoxical, non-mental, then it is possible to imagine a reality which is single, and that singleness is heterogeneous by nature. Infinity is its essential characteristic. Now, of course, there have been religious thoughts or ideas that have encompassed this notion. For example, we find in the Upanishads, this is the very idea of Brahman. The Brahman idea of Brahman is that Brahman is the only reality there is. It is one and infinite. It is radically one and it is radically infinite. It's not an order of infinity or a type of unity. It is the only thing there is, and that only thing is radically infinite. To talk about this, of course, we realize that this is the absolute, the idea of the absolute in Western philosophy. The absolute is beyond all possible formulation. It is the only thing there is, yet it is radically infinite because it is beyond all manifestation. But that kind of a singleness and infinity is, like we were saying about the core, the mystical core of the perennial idea, at a gap from all that can manifest, that cannot be manifest. It is something that jumps, one has to jump outside of any manifestation to reach. This, for example, is the idea of Advaita Vedanta, which believes that everything in the world, whatever we may call world, which is a manifest reality, is illusory or a projection, and it is only beyond this that one can arrive at a utter identity, not a manifestation, not a description, but utter identity that dissolves any sense of self in a indescribable, single infinite reality. So that is Brahman. That kind of idea can be talked about, but that cannot really be described. We can give a name to it, but it has no place in our world. It exists at a remove from the world of manifestation. But Sri Aurobindo was asking the question as to whether there is a bridge between that and this. Is there a bridge between the world of the absolute, the only thing there is, with radical infinity as its property, and this world of individualized entities that are expressing radical infinity, but that cannot be brought back into a unity without excluding something of its infinity. This idea arises because that is the very nature of our world. Our world is a world of plurality. It's a world of radical infinity. It is a world of separation. And that separation is arising also in experience through the fact that every entity within it, every form of consciousness within it, and we can go down to even the atom and use a panpsychist idea to say that there are forms of consciousness, attenuated forms of consciousness that go down to the most elemental material particle, and then that exist in a more complex and substantial fashion in animals and in humans, etc. But each of these is a universe to itself. Each of these is a center of the universe. Each entity, each conscious entity experiences itself as the center of the universe, surrounded by other conscious entities that are radically different from it. There may be points of similarity, but no sameness of experience. We cannot know what the experience of another being is. We can only come to words that form a convention of a certain kind of features of commonality, but not the core of experience. So this has been termed avidya or ignorance by the Indian tradition. So between this kind of plurality and a unity that is absolute, there seems to be a gap. This is the gap that the Indian tradition has assumed to be unbridgeable. Though if we go back in time to the Upanishads, some of the Upanishads, for example, the Mundaka Upanishad or the Prashna Upanishad, start by asking the question, what is the one thing, if known, everything else can be known? So this problem of knowledge, the central problem of knowledge, is actually moving in a philosophical direction where one of the highest questions it can ask is this question: is there some one thing that can be known that can actually be the source of every other knowledge? One answer to this question is what we've been discussing, that particular thing that can be known is the absolute consciousness, and that in substance has become everything else there is. This is a substantial answer, an answer of substance. It does not answer the question of knowledge per se, because the question of knowledge also arises out of the intuition of the law of rationality. We find the world to express a certain order. There is order to the world. Things are in some form of order. And so, is there one source of the order? The Western tradition has used the word logos for this. There is a source of order. And everything that we find in the world that is ordered is an expression of the logos, of the central principle of order within the absolute, you may say. That is, in a sense, the bridge. Now, this, however, is not something that is open to experience. We have not talked about, nobody has talked about how this can be experienced. Nevertheless, this notion of the logos has gained a lot of prominence in our times because modernity itself begins with these kind of ideas, these esoteric ideas of the logos as the foundation of the age of reason. The idea is that there is a single source of reason. You may call it divine reason, that has become this universe. And this idea leads to the age of reason, the age of science. So modernity arises through asking questions of this kind about reason. The idea is that there is a rational source to the world, and that is expressing itself in the orders of the manifest existence. And if we were to arrive at the laws of the world, we'd ultimately be able to reduce them to a very few or a single idea or law that can express everything. We can eventually do this in mathematics and in the ideas of physics. This was the notion of the logos that carried through into our times and made its expression most powerful statement in people like Einstein. This was Einstein's famous search for the principle of unity in physics, the grand unified theory. But nobody has really found this. And a contemporary philosopher, Gilles Deleuze, has put it a little facetiously in his one of his major tomes, Difference in Repetition, where he says that God was a mathematician who was calculating the orders of the world, but the world happened while he was doing his calculations. That in a way, the world is the remainder of the calculations of the divine. And the wisdom of this idea is in the fact that we find everywhere that there are orders, but we also find that any order that we can arrive at has its exceptions, and that things deviate from orders. There is no real thing that is perfectly adapted to an order in nature. There is always a little deviation from the order. So this kind of expression of the relationship between an ordering principle and a principle that moves towards almost the challenging of the world of order leads us to the sense of something that is more than rational, that includes rationality, but that is progressive, that breaks whatever order it establishes to create even greater or newer forms of order. So, in Sri Aurobindo's idea of the integral, we have to think about it philosophically as not a unity that tries to contain plurality, but an ideal that is beyond the mind, and so that does not follow that law of contradiction, because it is simultaneously one and infinite. It is not the one that contains the infinite. It is not infinity that challenges the one, but it is infinity as the very property of the one and only infinite being. So this is the idea of a kind of a super reason, a kind of a supramental reason. This is why the integral consciousness is the supramental consciousness. The integral consciousness is the consciousness that belongs to Brahman, belongs to the one who is infinite and who deploys his infinity as the manifestation. Where does the order of this manifestation come from? So this is the Western tradition uses the term logos, but Sri Aurobindo uses the term supermind for this. Now we may think about this as a philosophical problem. It seems on the face of it to be an impossibility, because it demands the supersession of the mind. It demands a kind of consciousness. We may say, if this is to be a experienceable reality, this is a form of consciousness that is greater than the mind, that can be one and infinite at the same time. That is the one who is infinite. And so this, if it can be experienced, it implies a transcending of the human boundaries. But we can hold it as a philosophical idea, and we can also hold it as a philosophical ideal to be experienced if we can find the means or methods to experience it. So this, one may say, is the basis of Sri Aurobindo's yogic search, because yoga does not take the human to be final. Yoga, and particularly in the modern way in which Sri Aurobindo sees yoga, he sees yoga as a device or means by which we can explore the field of consciousness, and if necessary can exceed the kind of consciousness that is given to us. And that would be the solution to the impossibility, the philosophical impossibility that we can present for ourselves. Now, how does one get there? And this brings us to the idea of our age and of Sri Aurobindo's what I've called Integrative Impulse. We talked about the severe critique of all forms of uniformity and universalism in our times, and the need to protect plurality on the other hand. We find that after the Second World War, there has emerged this kind of need for little histories, little descriptions, individualized, unique, and singular forms of understanding. But at the same time, we have found that we are moving towards a global world and interdependence. And this is to some extent due to the movement of the Enlightenment, due to what we've called the modern age. And it is due to the fact that in our seeking for structures that are universal, we have entered into a phase in human history that is global. And we've moved today into a life world that is interdependent globally and that is engaged in projects of a global scope in terms of space, time, as well as idea. We have entered into an academic period when comparative studies and, in a sense, universal studies, structuralist studies, have dominated the field of the academy, along with what we may call post-structuralist and postmodern studies. In our enterprises, we find that we work through more and more complex teams of people with diverse specializations, disciplinary specializations, who have to be able to talk together and arrive at integrated projects. So in all these cases, we find that there is a movement, particularly from the beginning of our present century, towards a greater integration. It's almost as if we've moved through the period of specialization and of fragmentation, and in a way, as having become more sensitive to the need for diversity and plurality, we are moving back towards the need for integrity, the need for bringing things together and forming larger unities, complex unities. The notion of a complex unity is the idea of something that moves towards the integral. Now, we find that when we talk about these teams that of varied specializations that come together to form projects, or we talk about the participatory turn, where individuals arrive at new forms of experience due to participation, it is much less possible for an individual to accomplish that had they not developed internal structures for reaching out and communicating with diversity. It is only to the extent that individuals have become internally potentially diverse enough that the communication between others becomes effective and one can enlarge and form new kinds of manifestations, new experiences, new ideas, new expressions. So this implies a certain internalization and a certain growth of one's capacities towards integrality, towards becoming inclusive of structures of otherness in oneself. Now, would this not be the same as the kind of inclusiveness that was being critiqued earlier? The answer is no. The difference between that and this is that here we are starting with the assumption that there is no goal of unity, within the mental frame that can bring us to something that can contain the infinity, but that there is a processual movement towards integrity. In other words, it is a ontogenetic function. It is moving towards, growing towards the integral, but knowing fully well that what we are defining as the integral is not within the boundaries of the human mental consciousness. What is truly integral cannot be mental. The true integral has to be supramental. But to arrive there, we have to prepare ourselves for the integral. And the preparation for the integral has to consist of searching for internal structures which bring about the possibility of gathering around us plurality, being able to encounter and interact with plurality. Can we find the points of vantage within ourselves that allows that to happen? So this brings me to the life of Sri Aurobindo again. I believe that this integrative impulse as an ontogenetic function is part of the evolutionary drive of our times. That this is exactly what is driving us today, to a certain extent, not only to protect our plurality, but also to enlarge ourselves in our complexity, to become more integral in the ability to come into contact with diversity and otherness. And that is something which Sri Aurobindo had as a kind of integrative impulse in him from very early in his life. So what I'd like to do is to take a closer look at his life, which I introduced in the last lecture, and show how the experiences that he gained, particularly the spiritual experiences that he gained when he came back to India, consolidated by him in terms of a dialectic to bring about integrity. What I'm trying to suggest is that we can look at this as a general problem, not as a problem that is specific to Sri Aurobindo. How, as a modern individual, Sri Aurobindo is an example of a modern individual who finds himself in this world. How would he or she build for themselves an inner life that would move towards the integral? And that would be done, I'm proposing, by finding for themselves a kind of architectonic which has within it a variety of forces organized through a dialectic, through certain opposites that can be in relation, but that can also gather around themselves more and more without really coming to an end of the infinite forces of life. So I believe that Sri Aurobindo discovered this in his early days in India. This is not something that one does entirely mentally, but it is an impulse, an instinct. It is arising from within to a large extent. It is a kind of sense, inner sense. And this inner sense came into engagement with the various traditions of India, spiritual traditions of India, and experiences related to these traditions, and it was able to constellate them around two primary traditions belonging to the Indian spiritual field that could form such a dialectic. For him, these two were Vedanta and Tantra. And these two are related to a certain school of Indian thought, Sankhya, which talks about a two categories. It's a dualistic school, Purusha and Prakriti. So before we actually delve into the Indian tradition and see the various kinds of influences that Sri Aurobindo had, I would like to talk about these two and to see how Sri Aurobindo organized his experiences around these two categories to form the kind of architectonic that became the basis of his integral practice. So for this, we have to realize that these two categories that he came to are two of the fundamental drives of all human beings. And this is something that Sri Aurobindo instinctively or intuitively connected with. All human beings at a certain point, a certain part of their existence, want freedom. And they're sensitive to the fact that there are forces that are binding them, that all human beings are imprisoned in a variety of ways. We're imprisoned by the facts of nature, by the constraints of our body, by the constraints of existence on earth, by the constraints of our society, our culture, our environing forces, the enemies of our culture, and various other constituents. And within these varied imprisonments, we are seeking for release. This is one very primordial drive of the human, the drive for liberation. This becomes the basis of what Sankhya calls the Purusha, which is pure consciousness, consciousness that is free from the bondage of every form of imprisonment or automatism, anything that can be predicted, anything that can defy the freedom of the creative power of consciousness. On the other hand, all individuals have something in them that seek for the maximization of control, mastery, control, and pleasure in their embodied lives, in the world. And that becomes the drive towards Prakriti or nature, which is empowered through Tantra. So we find that the drive for liberation becomes the guiding power behind the Purusha, pure consciousness, and opens up an entire area of spiritual practice that privileges that has generally been called Vedantic in the Indian tradition. The other drive towards the maximization of enjoyment in the world, which is through mastery of all the various forces of nature, is a drive that is privileged in Prakriti or nature force, and an entire area of spiritual practice is opened up in India called Tantra. We may be even more universal about it and say that the entire field of world spirituality, we can actually break it up into these spiritual practices that are practices of liberation, and we can break it up also into what are called magic practices or occult practices that give us access to the forces of the world and to their control and enjoyment. So these are the two which in Tantra actually are, some forms of Tantra are brought together and called Mukti and Bhukti. Mukti means liberation, Bhukti means enjoyment. So we find that Sri Aurobindo in his Integrative Impulse was approaching the spiritual life of India through the dialectic of these forces. and trying to create a certain kind of dynamic structure that one may call architectonic, or I've used the term yantra, meaning machine or engine, out of the relationship of these forces. Now, as I said, one does not arrive at this purely by one's thinking. One arrives at this from a deep impulse, which is existential in nature. And one doesn't arrive at a perfect architectonic or structure of practice by thinking about it. One arrives at that too creatively. One arrives at that by aspiring for it and allowing something to emerge almost in a miraculous fashion. And it may appear through numinous experiences. So, having said that much, I'd like to get into the early life of Sri Aurobindo to show how the experiences he had feature into this kind of architectonic. Firstly, to summarize the notion of the productive dialectic in Sri Aurobindo's life, we talked about the two drives in all human beings, one being the will to liberation, which is the direction of spirituality, and in the Indian context of Sankhya, that is the pole of the Purusha, and in the area of spiritual practice, that is the entire path of Vedanta. On the other hand, the other drive is the will to enjoyment, and in world traditions, this is the notion of magic. In Sankhya, this privileges the idea of Prakriti, and as a spiritual field, this is the entire field of Tantra. We may look at the characteristics of Vedanta and Tantra in the Indian tradition to see how these dialectics constellate themselves. Vedanta is gendered male because of Purusha, and Tantra is gendered or privileged. The gender privileged in it is female, which is Prakriti. Vedanta privileges being, known as Brahman, and Tantra privileges becoming or action, which is karma. Vedanta uses as its principal means purification, which is called Shuddhi. And Tantra uses as its principal means power, which is called Shakti. Vedanta's goals are liberation, which are called in Indian Sanskrit terms moksha, mukti, and samatha or shanti. And Tantra's goal is enjoyment, known as bhukti or ananda. And Vedanta's internal realization is knowledge by identity, which is its epistemic or knowledge goal. And that is known in Sanskrit as jnana or vidya. And the goals of Tantra internally are paranormal powers and worldly success, known as siddhi, and freedom from disease and physical immortality, known as arogya or sharira siddhi. So if we are going to look at the various phases in Sri Aurobindo's life, which I've discussed earlier, we find that he moves in the early part of his life. By the time he comes to his record of yoga in 1912, he moves through four locations which are significant in terms of his spiritual practice. The first location or topos is Baroda, and he's there from 1893 to 1905. And in this period, he encounters certain texts, he encounters certain religious traditions or forms of initiation. He encounters certain practices or certain expressions of practice. He has certain experiences. And these are implications that relate to one or the other of these two polarities of Vedanta and Tantra. So we find that in Baroda, he encounters two of his really foundational texts, spiritual texts that he uses all his life and that become mainstays in his practice. They are the Upanishads and the Gita. He doesn't really come across major regional traditions, though he does come across some yogis during this time. He does follow a kind of practice which is not a spiritual practice as such, but he begins translating the Upanishads and the Gita. And this in itself is a kind of spiritual practice because he engages with the text in a very deep way through translating and commenting on these texts. He has two major experiences during this period. One is the experience of what he is to call Jivatman, which is the static Atman conscious power, which is in a way beyond and behind this existence, individual existence, that he calls Jivatman. And that implies and constellates with Brahman and Vedanta. The other major experience that he has is the darshan or experience of the goddess Kali in a temple, a Kali temple. So this Kali darshan, which constellates to Shakti and to Tantra. So he encounters in a way the certain radical experiences that connect with these two different forms of the dialectic, the two poles of the dialectic. In 1905, he moves to Calcutta and he engages in the revolutionary movement from 1905 or /06 to 1907. He continues engaging with the Upanishads and the Gita. And in Bengal, he encounters the two regional traditions. They are the tradition of Shakta Tantra, which is very popular in Bengal, and he comes across some yogis that have paranormal powers. And he also comes across the Vaishnav tradition, which is also very powerful in Bengal. He comes across literature relating to Gaudiya Vaishnavism. His practices at the time are several. He continues to engage with texts through translation and commentary. He also starts his revolutionary praxis that in a way connects with Gita as well as with the Kali traditions of Tantra. And he writes certain tantric tracts which are also nationalistic. Two of these pieces of writing are the hymn to Durga and Bhavani Mandir. These are two of his texts of the period. So the implication that comes out of this is that he engages through the Upanishads and the Gita with Vedanta, and he also empowers the power of samatha, equality, and of karma yoga through his revolutionary praxis. These ideas come to the fore of his mind. And in his tantric attraction towards the goddess, he empowers Shakti, and therefore he constellates that with Tantra. He also starts doing some Hatha Yoga and Pranayama. He comes across some yogic practices, and that he encounters some psychic phenomena. We've already talked about that, and that are related to the body, Sharira, Siddhi, which he constellates again with Tantra. Now, for 1 week, he goes to Baroda and spends some time with his teacher, Vishnu Bhaskar Lele, in Baroda. in 1907. I mentioned earlier, Lele was of a Vaishnava kind of persuasion. We're not very clear which branch of Vaishnava, but certainly a branch that had as its esoteric core what is called Pancharatra Vaishnavism, because this kind of Vaishnavism becomes very clear in the record of yoga. The practices that he finds over here, one of them is meditation, and the other is surrender to Narayana, samarpan, or surrender to Narayana, and opening to the guidance from the divine, seen here as Narayana, the Adesha, or divine word or divine directive of Narayana, of God. So the experience he has over here, which we'll discuss later in Sanskrit terms, it can be called Brahma Karma Samadhi. It is union with Brahman and a kind of samadhi, absorption, because the world becomes unreal. But at the same time, he experiences a force, an agency that uses him to achieve its ends in the world. And so that is karma. And this union of Brahman and karma, which is one of the Gita's goals, and the Gita uses the term Brahma Karma Samadhi for that. And that's something that he experiences as a result of that particular encounter with Lele. So the implications of this have to do with karma and with Brahman. And karma is constellated by him to both Vedanta and Tantra, and the Brahman part is constellated to Vedanta. Finally, in the Alipur jail in Calcutta from 1908 to 1909, he encounters the Gita, and in there his two major initiations, one may say, that take place there, one directly through Krishna and one through Vivekananda. And he learns equality and surrender in the Alipur jail, samatha and samarpan. And through Vivekananda, he practices certain Vedantic types of meditation, what is called Mahavakya meditation, focusing on the line from the Upanishads, all this is the Brahman. Sarvam Khaluvidam Brahma. He starts repeating that to himself and trying to establish or stabilize the experience of Brahman in all things over there. The experiences he has over there include continuation of Brahma Karma Samadhi, the vision of Krishna in all things, Krishna Darshan, and the planes of cosmic knowledge above the mind, which in a sense, in Sanskrit terms, can be called Vijnana, and Siddhi, which is the occult powers that come from those planes. So we find that he constellates the connection with Krishna to the Vedanta and to the other kinds of occult powers that he gains to Tantra. This is how we find that all these variety of experiences that he's having through texts, spiritual personages, experiences, practices, and initiations are brought together by him to these two poles of Vedanta and Tantra, and or Purusha and Prakriti, following the Sankhya. And at a certain point, he receives this program called the Record of Yoga, or the Sapta Chatushta, or the seven quartets, which is the architectonic I'm talking about. We find that that architectonic really brings together all these various goals around the two poles of Vedanta and Tantra, of Purusha and Prakriti. Now, to have an idea of what that architectonic is, we can look at the symbol that ultimately becomes the symbol of Sri Aurobindo, that has 6 points and is formed by 2 triangles, an upward and a lower, ascending and a descending triangle with a lotus at the center. And each of the each of the corners of the triangle are related to one of those goals that he has experienced and that emerge through his practice. And we can see that diagram is the diagram that shows the 7 practices at the 7 corners, and the central practice being Yoga Siddhi, or the practice of yoga, the integral yoga that integrates all these various directions. So what we are seeing over here is 2 kinds of integration. One is an integration of practices that ultimately are constellating around the 2 poles of Purusha and Prakriti, and the other is the integration of Purusha and Prakriti itself. How does one prepare oneself by empowering both the male and the female, or the liberatory and the power-seeking parts of our existence, both given their freedom and their fulfillment in a variety of goals, and then how are they raised to a pitch where they unite, they become one at a higher pitch. This becomes the entire effort of the first part of Sri Aurobindo's notion of the integral yoga. And what I'm going to do now is put up the diagram of the various 7 quartets, and each of the 7 approaches show how they relate to Vedanta and Tantra, and show the Sanskrit terms, and you will see that even inside every one of those 7, we find that the goals constellate to the one of the 2 terms. So that the 4 Chatushta, the 4 achievements of each of these 7 approaches can be divided into Vedantic and Tantric goals, just as the 7 approaches themselves can be divided into Vedantic and Tantric goals. Next, in our next lecture, we'll look at how this architecture can be more studied in greater detail, and how it connects to the Indian traditions.